Hello everyone, this is Kat and welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be part 7 of the Breaking Point series. This fic is entitled Shattering Images. Here's the summary. Honestly, Izuku didn't know why he expected his meeting with Night Eye to go better than it did the first time he met All Might. He really didn't. Maybe it was because Muriel was there to introduce him to the man, but in the end it didn't matter. It didn't matter because he was not going to dive into another abusive relationship when he had just gotten out of the one he had with Bakugo. Honestly, getting his provisional license was easy, and he could hardly believe that he'd managed to do so with most of his classmates. Todoroki and Bakugo hadn't managed to get theirs, though. To be honest, Izuku had known that the blonde wasn't going to be able to get his license due to his attitude. He had improved, yes, but he was still harsh and rash and just rude in general, so the blonde's failing was expected, and it made something in his chest purr at the thought of succeeding where the blonde had failed. He had made sure to shove that deep down where no one could see it. Either way, it didn't matter in the end, as he sighed and shook his head, especially as the class waited for the day to start and for Aizawa to appear. He felt like something was going to happen to this class, especially after they got their licenses. He knew that their teacher would want to do something to increase their training or to give them a different perception. It was how their teacher was, after all, always throwing curveballs at them at all times, so he wasn't surprised when 3 third-years were invited to speak with them, nor when the biggest of the 3 had invited them all to fight him, at once. He wasn't very sure he wanted to actually fight this guy, especially as he watched him struggle with his pants. After he'd taken out Bakugo and Kirishima and Ojiro, he had taken out Ashido, Tsuyu, Ochako, and Kaminari just as quickly. Mineta, Hagakure, Jiro, and Yamomo were next. Ida, Koda, Sato, Sero, Shoji, and Aoyama all fell in what was like a blink of an eye, the next. He gulped, and his gaze had darted over to where Todoroki was watching next to Aizawa before looking back to where Muriel was standing, smiling at the younger team. "It seems that you are the last of your class now." He shifted as he took a fighting stance, but that smile stayed on his face. Izuku could only stare at him as he realized just how bright the other boy was with that smile on his face, his eyes shining in the light like sapphires. He didn't really know this boy, didn't know what power he held, but he already could tell that he could rival All Might one day. Just from the way he held himself and the way he acted, it was all similar to his mentor and hero. "Yeah, I'm the last one," he agreed as he lowered his body down to the ground, taking a stance that he'd seen Aizawa-sensei take a few times to give him extra speed and reaction time. That's what he was going to need to face against this 3rd year. Reaction and timing would lead to his victory. He had to remember all that he had learned while under Nezu, if only because it was a week and he was sure there was much more that he could gain from the small mammal. He'd use all the enhanced analysis classes to gain ground here and hope that he could find a weakness here soon. The only thing he had noticed was when he held his breath just before he fell into the ground. That was the only thing he saw, aside from his ability to predict. "Permeation," he muttered as he met the surprised teen's eyes, his own widening in realization at why this teen seemed familiar. "I had seen you at the last sports festival the year before, the 2nd year that consistently lost his pants and came in complete last place," he stated as he prepared to move, waiting for the right timing. "The student that came in last now in the top 3, meaning you either forfeited your chance at winning, or you found a way to use your quirk in a way you needed." "Oh, well, look at that. You seem pretty well informed. I wonder, why didn't you inform your class about me?" He tilted his head as his eyes had narrowed in his own thought. "That's because you didn't learn it before, just now." Aizawa cut with a smirk on his face, while the others all watched from the sidelines. Believe it or not, Midori literally just remembered that just now, and put all of what he just saw together. He saw the spark in the teen's eye, similar to what Nezu and himself got when they remembered something important or saw that they could use this to their advantage. The blonde gave a surprised huff as he stood tall and ready to attack. "Either way, unless he knows how I'm attacking, he still doesn't stand a chance," he shouted as he took a step forward and disappeared into the ground. The greenette gulped as he flipped around and ran a solid 5 yards from where he stood before turning back to face where he'd originally been and sunk down toward the ground once more. He had to wait. The longest a person had even held their breath without a quirk's help was about 25 minutes, but he doubted that this guy could hold his breath for that long. He was guessing more toward the 5 to 7 minute range. Then there was the fact that he was popping up out of the ground rapidly and quickly, meaning that the quirk, permeation, was allowing him to fall into the ground, but basic physics had to come back into play at some point. It meant that his mass couldn't match up with the Earth's, and so he was forced out of it instead, meaning that he was using his force to pop himself to places he wanted to be, predicting where his opponents would be in those seconds before it even happened that he reappeared. He had to use it to his advantage. He smirked as he caught the back of the 3rd year, leaping forward as the other had paused for that second. His fist slipped past the other's head before it was grabbed, and he was flipped over the other's shoulder in the throw. He couldn't waste a second as he twisted his body to the side and avoided the kick to the stomach, and held his arm up to block the fist heading for his face. He didn't close his eyes, as his fist had phased through his head, instead twisting his arm block into a backward swing that he had brushed the top of the other's hair with. It was then that he felt a hand grab a hold of his shirt collar. His back hit the floor, and then the air left his lungs. "I like this one," Mirio exclaimed as his pants were thrown at him by Aizawa. "He predicted a lot of my moves and only lost because I managed to slip through him and grab a hold of his collar when he wasn't looking." "Whoa, he was really fast, too. I've never seen someone push you around like that before." Nijiri was bouncing on the tips of her toes while Amajiki kept his head bowed. "Though you won in the end, so I'm not too terribly surprised by that." Mirio went full out again. Amajiki shook his head as he looked at the groaning and grumbling students, some of them still laying on the floor. He really needs to learn to hold back sometimes. Midoriya there, for punishment of going out after curfew, was under the watchful eye of Principal Nezu. Aizawa sent a small smirk at the three shocked expressions. While under the watch of the principal, he was taught and learned from the rats, so I'm not surprised that he was able to keep up with you. "I see," Mirio nodded before smiling and looking at the rest of the class. "Well, that's what you can learn from work studies." With that, homeroom had ended. "You've been hiding things from me again," Izuku stated as he stared at the blonde in front of him with tired and sad eyes. It hadn't taken too long to find the older man while he was on his jog, using his quirk to catch up to him in a set pattern that would take him to areas that he knew the older man had preferred. The older man gave a small cough at that before sighing and nodding his head in agreement. "There's more to it than I told you earlier about my relationship with Night-Eye. The reason why Night-Eye and I stopped working together is much worse than you think." "What was it?" he questioned as he looked at the other, with worried eyes. There were only so many options that could be chosen from, to try and fill in the blanks that All Might was leaving out. Gran Torino must have known this too, which was why he'd mentioned Sir Night-Eye as a possible agency to do his work study at. The retired hero had sighed as he looked at his successor. "Night-Eye's ability, foresight. He used it on me while I was in recovery from my surgery, back when I had first defeated All for One." He held a hand to his side where his scar was. "I'm sure you know what foresight is, and I'm sure you already know that he's never been wrong when using it before." "What's that got to do with anything?" He could feel his shoulders hunch, and he couldn't stop himself from wrapping his arms around his stomach. He'd read about Night-Eye, had guessed and hypothesized about what his quirk meant, but he could find little because the man had kept it a tight secret. "Night-Eye's ability. He's able to see the future, more precisely, a single person's future, and all that they will do, and what will happen to them. The further in the future he gets, the grainier it becomes," he exclaimed calmly as he tilted his head off to the side. "When he used it on me against my wishes, might I add, he saw my death." That sent a shock through the greenette, his eyes widening as what was said had slammed through his whole being. It was something he knew he had to hear and had to know, but there wasn't much he could do against the actual words. He wasn't sure that he'd be able to stop them or keep All Might from falling to what his one sidekick had told him. "How long?" he whispered out. The sigh released from the older man told of weariness and exhaustion, one that kept a firm hold on the man for so long. 6 or 7 years, we weren't quite sure. Either way, I know when it's time I'll go with a smile, but until then I'll— "No!" Izuku shouted as he glared at the stunned man, bright blue eyes staring at him in incomprehension. "I don't care what Sir Night-Eye says. I can't become #1 without you. I need you here with me. Helping me to get control of One for All and using it to save people. You can't die until you see me become the hero that you told me I could be, so you have to promise not to give up until then." He held a fist out to the other. Yagi could only stare at his student, those bright, determined eyes that spoke of such fire. It was something that he had seen when he'd first offered the quirk, and continued to see again and again and again. One he was going to see when this young man became a hero. He smiled as he knocked his fist against the boy's. "It's a promise, my boy." Izuku smiled at that. He hated himself right now, completely and utterly hated himself because he fell right back into the habit of trusting heroes that would do nothing but hurt him in the end. He could hardly believe how he had gotten stuck in this situation, but at the same time he could because he'd let All Might come up with a way to introduce him to Sir Night-Eye. Mirio Tokuda was in a work study under the one sidekick, and so had been Izuku's way of getting into the hero's agency. He had taken it full-heartedly, and was excited to meet the sidekick that had once gotten All Might to take him on and work well together until their falling out. He just wanted to be a better hero, and he thought that this hero would be able to do so in the end. He'd been wrong. "You aren't worthy to be the successor of One for All," Night Eye stated as he pointed at the boy in front of him. "But as a favor, I'll allow you a chance to join my agency. All you have to do is take this and stamp your application," he explained as he pushed his glasses up and watched the bowed head of the boy. "You have 3 minutes." Izuku, though, wasn't really listening after that first sentence. Really, who did this guy think he was? Did he really think that just because he was the sidekick of All Might so many years ago that he could tell the man who was worthy and who wasn't? Did he think that he had any hand in the quirk in the first place? Who the fuck was this guy to think that he was telling him that he wasn't worthy of the quirk that he was given by one of the greatest men that he'd known? Sure, All Might sucked as a teacher at the moment. He was constantly stumbling and not really giving any advice that Izuku could really use, much like when he'd first received the quirk, and then not really trained him after that for a while. It took Gran Torino kickstarting it for the blonde to really get his ass in gear. Not to mention his judgment sucked when it came to people and how they interacted, but then again, that was most people at UA, it seemed. His relationship with Bakugo, for example, was such an interaction the man had thought a simple rivalry until Izuku opened his mouth and he stood his ground. But that didn't mean that he couldn't make his own choices, that he couldn't make his mind up about something or choose his own path. He was strong and wise enough to do as he pleased, with his own quirk and who to pass it on to. He didn't need this guy's permission, or blessing, or whatever it was he had come here to do. He didn't need this man at all. He could find a way to improve without this asshole in his life. So with that, he bowed to the man instead. "I think I made a mistake," he stated calmly as he could. "It's obvious I have nothing to learn from you here." The man blinked as he looked at the young man in front of him, brows furrowed as he watched the reel in his mind stutter for a second before continuing on. "Oh, and what was that mistake?" he questioned as he pushed the reel to the side, not seeing anything different than he had earlier on. The boy would still be joining his agency, so nothing had changed. He didn't understand the stutter there for a second. "Because you're no different than the people who told me I couldn't be a hero." The boy stood up, eyes glowing with a fire even as they had darkened with something he couldn't place. "You'll only take me on so you can try to make me give up One for All. That's the only reason you take me, to make me give it to someone else that you believe deserves it." "Correct." Night Eye didn't bother hiding his intentions, especially as the boy already knew them. "Mirio is more deserving of the quirk than you. He has the smile and the drive that All Might did and still does possess. He'll be the next symbol of peace, I'm sure of it." He nodded to himself as if he was truly in the right. "That's why you should hand it over as quickly as possible. The sooner he has time to gain control over the quirk, the better." "But that's not a decision you get to make," Izuku growled out as he clenched his fist, lightning flaring up around him. "You didn't have this quirk. You never held it, and it was never given to you, and you never gave it away, so I don't understand why you think you have any right in thinking where it should go." He could feel the blood beginning to pool where his nails dug into his skin. "So what the fuck do you think you're doing, trying to tell me what to do with it when you have no control or say in what I do now?" His eyes snapped into a sharpness that caught the hero's breath. The man almost wanted to take a step back, but he held his ground instead. The film in front of his eyes had stuttered again, and this time he noticed a change in the reel. He no longer saw the flashes of a battle between him and the boy. No, that was completely gone, completely out of sight now. He gasped as he realized that this one stone-solid future he had seen had completely changed. "This quirk was All Might's, and his choice was me, and now it's mine," Izuku almost completely snarled. "I won't let you make me give it up because you're an asshole who thinks that he has any right to control another person because he's afraid." "Afraid?" he questioned as he focused on the child once more, ignoring the continued stuttering of the film and how it would change minutely at every moment, several paths opening up like he'd never seen before. "And why do you say I'm afraid?" "Because you saw All Might's death, and you and I both know that's true." They kept their eyes on the other, never looking away. "But that doesn't mean that you get to decide on how he lives the rest of it. That doesn't mean that he can't fight the fate that you've seen and make it different. I won't let him break his promise, and I won't break mine to him." Night Eye frowned at that before huffing at the child. "It seems I might have underestimated you." He walked over to his desk and quickly stamped the document. "I'll hand this in, and you can begin working with Mirio tomorrow." He needed to figure out how this child had changed the future like he had. He'd never seen the reel completely changed like that before, and it was something he needed to figure out so that he could save All Might. "I already told you, I'm not going to work here." That made the man pause as he stared down at the document before him. "It was a mistake coming here. It's obvious I won't learn a thing from you. You'll only hold me back while trying to make me give up One for All." With that, the teen turned on his heel and walked out of the office, leaving the man stunned. Honestly, Izuku wasn't sure what he expected out of the man. That had been a bullshit interview, and he wasn't going to harm himself by putting himself into another abusive situation. He'd done that with Bakugo, and he wasn't doing it with another if he could help it. If that meant he wasn't going to intern with Sir Night-Eye, then so be it. He'd find a different hero that could help him improve his techniques. Someone who was similar to his own abilities and capabilities. That would be ideal. He was so inflamed that he ignored the older third year, waving at him with a smile that quickly halted and turned into a worried frown. He ignored Bubble Girl, who was watching him go with a sad smile and a shake to her head. He ignored Centipeter, who had watched him go neutrally. He left the building behind, done with wasting his time on people intent on slowing him down and making him do things they wanted. He'd learned from Bakugo to never bow and to never give up. He wasn't going to let a hero take that blonde's place. He was so incensed and ignorant of his surroundings that he was bowled over by a little girl while passing an alleyway. "Sir?" Mirio questioned as he walked into the office, the door almost completely torn off its hinges from how hard it had been slammed into the wall. It was obvious that Midoriya had been incensed and lost control of his quirk. "What happened?" The man sighed as he looked down at the document in front of him, his stamp held tightly in hand. "It seems I've miscalculated on how much that boy would take." "Is this about One for All again?" Mirio had known about the quirk for some time, Sir having been grooming him to take it on for a while now, though the blonde had thought that he would most likely refuse it if the symbol of peace ever offered it to him. "Yes, it is. That boy that just walked out of my office, he's the inheritor of One for All, an unworthy child that has no idea how to use it and how to be a symbol for the new world," he explained as he turned to face the intern. "I had intended for him to pass it to you, a much more worthy candidate." "Well, that's stupid." Night-Eye stared at the teen in shock, taking in the completely serious look on the other's face. "Mirio?" "I hadn't told you yet, but I was going to refuse taking the quirk if it was ever offered," the teen stated sternly. "I already have a quirk that's hard to control. Adding on another would just have made it worse, so it's null and void of a topic to begin with," he explained with a smile on his face. "I'm going to be the best with my own power, not one you made another person give up." "I believe that would be the best course, not only for you but for All Might, and the rest of humanity," Night-Eye stated. "Not with what I've seen in the future." Blood and screams, the horror of watching All Might fall to his knees, and a monster over him as he reached down with all 5 hands to finish him off, once and for all. The skeletal form of the man unable to prevent his coming fate. "But that doesn't mean that you try to force someone else to give up." Mirio sighed as he ran a hand through his hair before smiling. "Midori has potential I've seen, that I've faced. He's the only one of the first years that lasted more than 5 seconds against me. He predicted my movements and kept up. He isn't someone you brush aside." Night-Eye could only watch as his protege smiled widely. "I have no doubt he'll be the number 1 in the future." That was when Night-Eye felt a tug, and he looked back at the reel in the corner of his eyes, gasping at what he'd just seen in the next few minutes. "Oh, are you okay? You took a bit of a tumble there," Izuku said as he looked at the little girl that was against his side where they were on the sidewalk. She'd ran into him so hard that she'd knocked him over. He looked over her and took in the long silver hair and the little horn that was extending from the corner of her forehead. She wore a short-sleeved white dress. What really caught his attention, though, were the bandages that were covering her arms and legs and the trembling that was encompassing her whole body. It was obvious that she was afraid of something, that he wasn't understanding. "Hey, are you okay? What's wrong?" He pulled her up to his chest and wrapped a hand around her back to support her. She couldn't be older than a 4-year-old, maybe 5, but that was pushing it with her size. "Please," she whispered, and Izuku had to listen closely to hear it. She was so quiet and so scared he wasn't sure what to do. "It's okay, I'll help you." He stood up, keeping a firm hold on her and holding her tight against his chest. "Let's see about getting some help. Maybe we can find your parents." "There won't be a need for that." A voice called from the alley, and Izuku turned to stare at the man that had wandered out. White-gloved hands at his sides, the black fur on his green bomber jacket swayed in the breeze. The crimson and gold plague doctor mask hid most of his face, but Izuku could see the other's golden eyes and how cold they were. "Come now, Eri. Don't bother the teen. He looks like he was just heading somewhere." No worries," Izuku murmured as he hunched over the little girl slightly. "I was just heading back home when we ran into each other," he explained, heart beating rapidly in a sense that he hadn't felt since he was in middle school, cornered by Bakugo, a sense that said he was in danger. "Who are you?" "Me, I'm Eri's father, of course." The man held out a hand toward the girl. "If you'll just hand her over, we'll be on our way." The teen gulped as his grip had tightened. He didn't understand why, but he felt that this man was lying. His eyes were so cold, and the way that the child in his arms, Ari, had stiffened when he was asked to hand her over spoke more of just a father and a daughter situation. "Please, help me," Ari whispered, and it reached him, along with the grip on his shirt tightening, and it spoke of the terror that she was obviously facing. He didn't want to hand her over. He didn't want to let her go, and so he didn't. He had learned to hold his ground, for good or for worse. "I'm sorry, but I don't think she really wants to let go," he said softly, hunching tightly toward the girl. "That's fine, but Ari, we need to go. We don't want to waste this young man's time." The man's eyes narrowed as the little girl's trembling began to worsen. "After all, I'm sure he has more important things to worry about." "No, I don't. Not really," Izuku exclaimed with wide eyes as he tried to think of a way to help take care of this girl. "I don't really have anything going on, not like anyone would miss me," he muttered as he thought about what Night-Eye thought of him. Along with Bakugo, he was sure his friends and the teachers would notice he was missing at some point, but it would be a while before it happened. After all, he was supposed to be at Night-Eye's agency for a while, not expected to return until late that night. "Oh, and why is that?" the man questioned with a raised brow, now interested in the teen. "Oh, because, I'm quirkless," he exclaimed, and his eyes widened in horror. He hadn't meant to say that. That wasn't something that he'd wanted to say to anyone ever again. He wasn't quirkless, and he shouldn't be telling people he was, but something inside of him had made him think that that was the safer option. The man was quiet for a long moment before he seemingly made a decision and made a come-hither motion with his hands. "If that's so, then maybe we can help each other. Come with me and we can talk about it." Izuku gulped as he looked down at the girl in his arms. Ari's shaking had increased, but he couldn't make himself let her go. So he made a decision. He followed the man into the alleyway. "Aizawa." He answered the phone with a sigh, tired as he looked over applications in front of him. Some of them were applications for work studies, others for time off of campus for various things. "It's Night-Eye," was the clipped answer. "Has Midori Izuku returned to the dorms yet?" That caused the older man's eyes to focus as he sat up straight. "No, he hasn't. I assumed he was still at your agency with Mirio, discussing a possible work study with you." There was a curse and a fist slamming onto the counter. "I had hoped that what I saw wasn't true. Listen to me, Eraserhead. When Midoriya returns, you're to bring him back here at once. He'll have information that I need. Do not delay a second on this. Millions of lives could be on the line." With that, the man hung up on him. Before the teacher could respond, he sighed as he rubbed at his eyes. His phone clenched tight in his fist. "What the hell did you do this time, problem child?" he questioned as he stood up and walked out of the room in the dorms. He headed to the front of the buildings and stood, waiting for the child to return. He nodded at the other students that appeared and walked by him, speaking briefly with those that stopped, but otherwise keeping an eye out for a familiar head of bushy hair. It wasn't until almost 10 past curfew when he showed up. "Where have you been?" Aizawa growled as he glared at the student in front of him. His eyes narrowed further as he noticed the color the child had and the blood that was splattered on his shirt, eyes wide with horror. "What happened?" Izuku could only gulp as he looked up at his teacher, and then collapsed on the ground, grasping at his chest as panic completely swarmed him. The teacher was next to the student in a nanosecond, trying to figure out what had happened while trying to calm the other. Whatever it was the reason why Night-Eye wanted him to bring the teen to his agency immediately. All right, everyone. This concludes Shattering Images, the 7th fic and part to the Breaking Point series. The 8th fic will be next. Hope you guys are still enjoying this one, and as always, thank you so much for listening.